Hi everyone, welcome to our YouTube channel Odontology, the study of teeth. Today we are going to see about the development of face and primary palate in detail. This is one of your important 5 mark or 10 mark question. It can be asked in your final year pedo paper or in your third year oral pathology exam also, and moreover you will be having the same question in first year embryology, anatomy embryology subject also. Okay, so please listen to this question, and for this question you definitely need a diagram. Okay, so don't forget to draw the diagram in your exams. Okay, so let's see the development of face first. At the end of fourth week only the facial the development of face starts. Okay, before going into detail, you should know first of all what is pharyngeal arch, how many pharyngeal arches are you having. Okay, so I'm not explaining the pharyngeal arches in detail. We are gonna just deal with only two pharyngeal arches. Okay, as I said, in the end of fourth week of gestational period, the facial prominence, this is your facial prominence, this facial prominence develop in the fetus. Okay, this is your facial prominence. Okay, from this facial prominence only the development of face starts. Okay, this facial prominence is also called as frontonasal prominence or frontonasal process, and this facial prominence also develops from the first pharyngeal arch. Um, this facial prominence is consist of or derived from the first pharyngeal arches. Okay, first pair of pharyngeal arches, and the mesenchyme derived from the neural crest, or neural crest derived mesenchyme plus first pharyngeal arch, first pair of pharyngeal arches only. These facial prominence is developing. Okay, now we have already know what is meant by facial prominence, right? So next we will see what is the first pharyngeal arch, and um, how the face development happens. To know in detail, you should know what is meant by stomodium or stomatadium. Okay, so this is your stomadium. Stomadium is nothing but your future oral cavity is called stomadium or stomatadium. Let's identify what is where is that stomadium or future oral cavity. Okay, so the process, see I have marked here, right? This is your first pharyngeal arch. As I said earlier, the frontal prominence and the maxillary prominence are developed from the first pharyngeal arches only. So let's see, this is your first and this is your second pharyngeal arch. Second pharyngeal arch is also called as mandibular arch, and the third curve is your third pharyngeal arch, and the fourth one is your fourth pharyngeal arch. Okay, the diagram will be very easy once you repeatedly draw the diagrams and practice yourself. Okay, so this is your second pharyngeal arch, that is your mandibular arch. Then the first one is your maxillary arch, or it only helps in the development of the upper lip. Okay, the gap I have given between the two dark places, right? This is your stomatadium or future oral cavity. See here. Okay, the colored portion which is lateral to the stomatadium is your maxillary process or maxillary prominence. Okay, I am denoting it as MP, maxillary prominence. It's very easy to identify that the space lateral to the stomatadium is your maxillary prominence, and the space above and the structure above to your stomatadium is your facial prominence. Okay, lateral is maxillary prominence, above is facial prominence or frontonasal process. That's why I have written like FNP or FP. You can write both. Okay, so once after knowing all these structures in this image, let's see how the development of the face occurs. Okay, in the facial prominence there will be a thickening of epithelium. Okay, thickening of epithelium on both the sides of frontal prominence, or that is facial prominence or frontonasal prominence or process. Okay, these local thickening of the surface epithelium causes Nasal placods. Okay, here I have marked little in a black color, right, round one, that is your nasal placods. So nasal placods, it's just like, see, like a round. Okay, I have marked here. So the thickening of the surface epithelium on both sides of your facial prominence will land up in the formation of nasal placods. These nasal placods at the 5th week convert into invaginate and produces the nasal pit. Nasal pit. Okay. So that and all will be explained in the upcoming image. You should have a better image to explain such things. Okay. So here is your nasal placods, and again it will invaginate and produce a nasal pit. Okay. So see, this is your nasal pit. Once if it is invaginating, means the tissues which is surround that pit will gives a ridge like tissue. It will create a ridge of tissue that surrounds each pit, that forms the nasal pit. Okay. So at the 5th week, these nasal placods will invaginate and produce nasal pits. In doing so, it will create a ridge of tissue that surrounds each pit, that forms nasal prominence, that is medial nasal prominence and lateral nasal prominence. How will you differentiate the medial nasal prominence and lateral nasal prominence is just see, I will explain you. See, this is the pit and this is the prominence, that is the ridge of tissues that is surrounds the pit, right. If it is medial sides, medial to the medial side means that is medial nasal prominence. If it is lateral side by lateral nasal prominences. Okay. So see, here you see. So this is your I have colored there is some mistakes that the medial side should have, both the sides should have yellow color, and I mistakenly colored with the blue color. Okay, this is your nasal pit. First see, this is your nasal pit. The thickened tissue, that is the ridge of tissues that is lateral or away from the midline, is your lateral nasal prominence, and the ridge of tissues that is medial to each other, close to each other, which is one is facing medial, that is your medial nasal prominence. See, this is your lateral nasal prominence or lateral nasal process. And this is your medial nasal prominence. I am marking it as M and P. Okay. Lateral nasal prominence are L and P. So once after the formation of the ridge occurs, this orange one is your maxillary prominence. The first itself I told you, the process that is lateral to your stomatarium is your maxillary prominence. See, this is here I am denoting it as MP. These maxillary prominence will increase in size towards the midline and causes the compression of the medial nasal prominence towards the midline. Medial nasal prominence towards the midline, because of the increase in size of the maxillary prominence, causes the compression. Okay. See. So once again I will tell you, once the pit is formed, invaginates, the nasal placods invaginate, it will land up in the formation of the nasal blitz, which results in a creation of a ridge of tissue that surrounds each pit. Okay. Once this over, this MP got increase in size, that is the maxillary prominence or the maxillary process will get increase in size, which results in the compression of the medial nasal prominence or medial nasal process. Okay, towards the midline. So this is your medial nasal prominence. The compression will create it and it will fuse in the middle. Okay, when the size of the maxillary prominence increases. So this is the next image. See, I have drawn that the medial nasal prominence are joined together, and this is your maxillary prominence. I am denoting it as MP. See, this is the lower one is your stomatodium. This is your medial nasal prominence or medial nasal process. After the compression towards the midline, this medial nasal prominence fuses together and produces the, so both the sides, when the pressure is applied, these two fuses in the midline and join together, okay, and thus so the fused M and P is present, okay. So once the fusion gets over between the medial nasal processor and maxillary processor, so see, this is your the cleft between, or the joint between the medial nasal processor and maxillary processor. Once the fusion gets over, this cleft will result in the loss of, the cleft will lose, okay, loses attachment and fuses together and forms the upper lip, okay. Fuse together results in the formation of upper lip. That means the maxillary process joins with the medial nasal processor by deleting the, or by the loss of cleft, and forms the upper lip. See, here the upper lip is formed, right. This is your medial nasal process joins with the maxillary process, okay. Then once it happens, what happens to the once, I mean, the fusion of the medial nasal process and maxillary process happens, what happens to the cleft present between the lateral nasal processor and the maxillary process, okay. The cleft is present between the maxillary process and lateral nasal process are separated initially by a deep furrow, okay. That deep furrow is called the nasolacrimal groove. So see, this is your nasolacrimal groove. See, this is your nasolacrimal groove. This deep furrow is also called as the nasolacrimal groove. These nasolacrimal groove, the floor of the groove will have the ectoderm, right. This ectoderm forms a solid epithelial cord, detaches from the overlying epithelium after canalization. The nasolacrimal duct is formed, and from the upper end it will form the lacrimal sac. That is what explained here, okay. So listen carefully. The cleft between the maxillary process and the lateral nasal process are separated initially by a, so maxillary process and lateral nasal processes are separated initially by a deep furrow, okay, or a cleft, okay. These deep furrow is called as the nasolacrimal groove. I am indicating as NLG, okay, NLG, okay, nasolacrimal groove. These nasolacrimal groove, the floor ectodermal of this nasolacrimal groove forms a solid epithelial cord that will further gets detached from the overlying epithelium and forms the canalization. After this canalization will forms the nasolacrimal duct, okay. This nasolacrimal duct, the upper end of the nasolacrimal duct forms the lacrimal sac, which can be explained detailed in when we are dealing with the lacrimal apparatus or lacrimal subject, okay, I mean topic, okay. So I have explained here how this deep furrow or nasolacrimal groove is converted into, I mean becomes a lacrimal sac, okay. So what happens to this maxillary process then? Once this happens, the cleft will results in the loss of cleft, and after that detachment of maxillary and LNP, it will merge together and forms the cheek area, cheek prominence and cheek area, okay. What happens to the nasolacrimal duct? This nasolacrimal duct will distribute from the medial corner of the eye to the inferior meatus of the nasal cavity in the deeper section, okay. In maxillary prominence enlarge and forms cheeks and maxilla. See here, medial canthus to the inner concave, I mean inferior concave of the nasal cavity. So this maxillary process will forms the cheek and maxilla that I have drawn here or marked here using an orange color pencil. Okay, so this is your entire formation of the face. So in the formation of the face itself, we are dealing with the nose also, right? This nose is mainly made up of 5 facial prominence. Okay, 5 facial prominence is needed for the formation of the nose. Okay, what are they? Let's see. First prominence is your frontal prominence. Okay, frontal prominence only. This first pharyngeal arch is only giving a frontal prominence and maxillary prominence, right? So first one is your frontal prominence, which gives the bridge of the nose, and second one is your merged medial nasal prominence. You have two pairs of one pair of medial nasal prominence, right? On both the sides you have one, right? So that forms the crust and tip of the nose. Okay, that is your two medial nasal prominence, and third one is your two lateral nasal prominence. So fused one, these two fuses and gives the crest and tip, and third one is your two lateral nasal prominence, that is also two. Okay, fused together and forms the side of the nose or ala of the nose. These are the three prominence which is helpful in the, or this is which land up in the formation of the entire nose. Okay, one facial prominence, two medial nasal prominence fused together and forms the crest and tip of the nose. Facial prominence forms the bridge of the nose, and lateral nasal prominence land up in the formation of the ala of the nose. In dealing with the formation of the face itself, we are going to see how the primary palate is also formed. That is also called as intermaxillary segment. So let us see the intermaxillary segment in detail in the upcoming images. See, this is your next image, the formation of intermaxillary segment. It is also called as a primary palate. As a result of medial growth of the maxillary prominence, two medial nasal prominence fuse together, not only fuse together and it all at the surface. Okay, it will also fuse together in the deeper section also. I repeat, as a result of a medial growth of the maxillary prominence, the two medial nasal prominence is fused together, right? It will not fuse only at the surface, it will also fuse in the deeper section also, which results in the formation of the intermaxillary segment or primary palate. So this is what I am writing. Deep also it will fuse and forms the intermaxillary segment or primary palate. These two merged prominence is a result of the intermaxillary segment. I mean, these two merged prominence composed of three component. Okay, one is your labial component, and second one is your upper jaw component, and third one is your palatal component. Let's see the three component. Okay, so you have three components. First component is your labial component, which forms the philtrum of upper lip. Okay, second component is your upper jaw component, as I said earlier. Upper jaw component, which carries 4 incisor teeth. And third one is your palatal component, which forms the triangular primary palate. Okay, so let us see all the three components in the image. So in this image, the first one, I have drawn like a bow. Okay, that is your philtrum, that is your labial component, and the 4 teeth which is present, that is your upper jaw component, and the triangular section I have drawn where it bears the 4 teeth below to that region is your palatal component. So see, this is your philtrum. The shape I have drawn here above is your facial aspect. Okay, in face you will have that kind of thing below your nose, right? That is your philtrum. And this 4 teeth includes, that is your second component, that is your upper jaw component. And third triangular bone that is present is your palatal component or a primary palate. So this intermaxillary segment continues as a rostral portion of nasal septum formed by the frontal prominence. The rest of the palate can be we will be dealing in the upcoming classes as a secondary palate formation. That is also one of the 5-mark questions that can be asked repeatedly in your anatomy and pedo papers. Okay, so let us brush up once again the entire topic. In your first topic, you have your at the end of 4th week, this is your, first of all, this is your facial prominence and your pharyngeal arches I have drawn here. First pharyngeal, second pharyngeal is also called as mandibular arch, and first one is your maxillary prominence. Third and fourth, here your maxillary the process which is lateral to the stomatodium is your maxillary process, and this is your frontonasal process, that is cephalic to your stomatodium. The lateral thickening will form the nasal plug cords of the epithelium of facial prominence, which will result in the invagination and produces the nasal pit. So in this image you can see that the formation of the nasal pit. Once the nasal pit is formation, there will be a ridge of tissue which forms the processes like medial nasal process and lateral nasal process, 2 medial and 2 lateral nasal process prominence. Okay, so after that there will be a maxillary process, that is lateral to a stomatodium, will increase in size and compress the medial nasal prominence or process, which results in the pressure created in between them, and it will result in the fusion of 2 medial nasal prominence, and it will fuse together. Okay, so this is your maxillary prominence, and the fusion of your 2 medial nasal prominence occurs. In the next image you will be seeing the fusion of the 2 medial nasal prominence. Okay, once these two things fused, the medial nasal prominence and the cleft between the stomatodium will also lose its cleft, and it will form maxillary prominence, the medial nasal prominence, the gap between it will lose and will result in the formation of the upper lip by fusing together. Okay, so see the formation of the upper lip, and after that the cleft between the maxillary prominence and the lateral nasal prominence will also forms a deep furrow, that is called as, see here, the maxillary prominence and the lateral nasal prominence is separated by a deep furrow, that is also called as nasolacrimal groove. The floor of the ectoderm will land up in solid thickening and forms the nasolacrimal duct. The upper end will forms the lacrimal sac, which results in the which occupies the space between the medial canthus of the eye to the middle corner of the eye to the inferior meatus of nasal cavities. And maxillary prominence also enlarge and forms the cheek and maxillary portions. Maxilla, see, this is I have written here. Okay, so that's how the nose is formed, and the 5 facial prominence which helps in the formation of the nose has. Let's see what are the 5 prominences helps in the formation of the nose. You have 3 components. First one is your as I said earlier, first one is your facial prominence that forms the bridge of the nose, and 2 medial nasal prominence which fuse together and forms the crest and tip of the nose, and third one is your LNB, that is your lateral nasal process, which forms the sides and or ala of the nose. That is how the nose is formed. And last one is your intermaxillary segment. Intermaxillary segment is also called as primary palate. As a result of medial growth of the maxillary prominence, 2 medial nasal prominence fuse not only at the surfaces, it also takes place in the deeper level also. So 2 merged prominence is the intermaxillary segment. It has 3 components, that is your labial component, upper jaw component and palatal component. Labial jaw includes philtrum, and upper jaw contains 4 incisors, and the third one is your triangular bone, that is your palatal components, and the rest and all the secondary component, we will see that in detail in your upcoming classes. That is your secondary palate formation as a individual, I mean a separate 5 mark question. Hope you like the video. Please click the like button and subscribe our channel. Thank you.